Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. First of all, we would like to thank the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, American Special Almaty, and of course, our amazing speaker, Stephen Friedman. Stephen Friedman is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, a scientist, artist, and also a great speaker. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being here with us today, and thank you, the audience. Please feel free to ask your questions, give your comments. We will look forward to answering them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for introducing me. Thank you for your continued participation and facilitation of the talks. I greatly appreciate it. Also, I want to express my gratitude to the American Consulate in Almaty, Dana, Elmira, and everybody involved in making this possible and in offering this platform to provide a philosophical perspective on a wide range of contemporary issues. Today it's 10 o'clock in Los Angeles, August 5th. But in Almaty, it's already August 6th. August 6th is a sacred day, a sacred occasion, a sacred commemoration. It's Hiroshima Day. And that's the motivation for this morning's talk. It's a point of convergence that the Olympics, which I addressed last week, are taking place in Japan. Hiroshima Day obviously is focused upon Japan and the first atomic bombing. The atomic bombing of Nagasaki happened 3 days later on August 9th. Now, I've made the point that philosophical talks require an element of spontaneity in the sense that as moments change, as I get, for example, closer to August 6th, more ideas come to mind, more ideas infused with the emotionality of the commemoration. And that inspires my thinking and alters my sort of the direction of approach that I decide to take. So, and I've emphasized before that a philosopher like Wittgenstein never gave a prepared talk. So these are always evolving. And for me, the critical moment where the talks congeal in my mind is often the day of, is often today. And that was true of this day as well. When I woke up, I thought to myself, something I hadn't been anticipating, maybe it might be appropriate to select a piece of music to play the opening or to make comments on in relation to Hiroshima. A piece of music that might capture something of the nature of the event, its significance, its horror. I am, since I was a teenager, I've been studying Western classical music. I've, at this point, because of what technology allows, I've listened effectively to all the works of Beethoven, all the works of Bach, of Mozart, of Schubert, of Brahms, of Monteverdi, all basically the highest order of composers in at least the Western tradition. And those represent some of the greatest composers of any tradition. Composers like Beethoven, who distill like an essence of the human spirit and its response to the urgencies and the demands of the human condition, the challenges of that condition, to demonstrate an attitude, the possibility of triumph. I've quoted before from the musicologist Lucas Foss, who in a conversation with the Finnish composer Sibelius during World War II, talked of how eternal life is not a duration, but an intensity. And so far as there is the highest level of music in the world, the type of music that Beethoven, for example, composed, there was always something we can do about the worst that the world can do to us. So I started going through works by Beethoven, by Mozart, by other composers. I have playlists that I've made of the pieces that I find most inspiring, most profound, most capable of addressing the extremity of the human condition. Looking for a piece of music that, again, might be appropriate, that might conjoin with Hiroshima. And I always do this experimentally. I do it with an open mind. I don't go into this process thinking, well, it's got to be this particular composer or this particular composition, or based on previous experience, this should work or must work. I'm always seeing what will in fact work. Nothing did. Nothing. I mean, no matter what the work of Beethoven or Mozart I listened to, no matter how elevated the piece was based on my experience of it, maybe 100 times or several hundred times in the past, nothing seemed appropriate. Nothing rose to the occasion of the extremity, of the horror, the magnitude of Hiroshima. I proceeded to run some poems through my mind that, again, represented the highest response of the human spirit to the challenges of the human condition. Like poems by Emily Dickinson. While we were fearing it came, but came with less of fear, because the fearing it so long had made it almost fair. Didn't rise to the occasion of the horror. Or A.E. Housman, I to my peril of cheat and charmer came clad in armor by stars benign. Hope lies to mortals, and man believes her, but man's deceiver was never mine. Not to that level. Now, it's actually an experience I've had before when I found out, just in terms of circumstances of my personal life, that I was adopted. And I found this out as an adult about 20 years ago. That was a traumatic event for me. And I went home and ran through, not just major composers, not just poets, but philosophers, philosophers that had always been able to console. Confucius, one world at a time. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher. You are an actor in such a play as the author may choose. The great Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. I am a something among somethings, and so it goes. Mark Twain, life is dream, dream better dreams. Kafka, somewhere help is waiting, and the beaters are driving me there. But all of those things fell short of addressing the extremity of discovering that one was adopted, and so one's whole sense of identity was wrong. None of those also rose to the level of the occasion of Hiroshima. They didn't make me feel like better contemplating the event. They didn't seem to be adequate to address its extremity, its horror. Well, and by the way, what is that horror? Survivors from the outskirts of the city, looking towards the city after the explosion, 8:16 in the morning, local time, on August 6th, said, "The city has ceased to exist." Well, what happened to Hiroshima? When you see that mushroom cloud in photographs rise over the city, the mushroom cloud that's generated from any atomic, nuclear, thermonuclear explosion, well, in the case of Hiroshima, that mushroom cloud was Hiroshima. Hiroshima, the remains of that city were in that cloud. Other people wrote, again, these are survivors, wrote that they thought the world had ended. That this wasn't for them, in their imagination, a local event. It was a universal cataclysm. It represented the end of days, the end of time. Many Japanese are Buddhists. Some of the Buddhists, in Hiroshima, thought they had awakened to Buddhist hell. That the world was over and they were now in hell. That's the extremity that our human responses need to address insofar as they can. Well, in the case of my adoption experience, what did work were my philosophical aphorisms. And I found that, now obviously, discovering that one's adopted is not anywhere close to the magnitude of, again, the terror, the horror of Hiroshima. But art, music did not console me. Religion, I read various religious writings in response to that discovery, didn't console me, but my own philosophical aphorisms did. And I found that just opening one of my books of aphorisms to a random page and reading random aphorisms did make me feel better, did rise to the occasion of the adoption issue, the adoption revelation, and how disorienting, how transformative, that knowledge was. Well, aphorisms like, "Do not suffer that it ends," it was not redemption. And my commitment to making public the philosophical results really goes back to that occasion, that circumstance. It was when I began to think that, well, perhaps the philosophy now needs to be taken seriously if it's capable of addressing emotional issues that other responses, that I've encountered, that I've used in the past, fail to address. In the case of Hiroshima, I ran through some aphorisms, and the ones that worked, for example, when I was experiencing the trauma of the Northridge earthquake in 1994, when I was at the point of death because my apartment building was collapsing around me. And I thought literally I had reached the point of death. I tell this story in Phalaris' bullet play I did in New York about how I ran an aphorism, selflessness, how one acts not out of need, through my mind. And it didn't work. It had worked on every previous occasion, for every previous type of stress or challenge, but not at the moment of death. I went to a deeper aphorism in my writings at the time, a logical aphorism that represented the foundation of my philosophical thought at that point. Again, this is almost, 27 years ago. And that aphorism was, the meaning of the world is its most general representation, which sort of addressed the nature of perspective and provided perspective on the earthquake and on the dying experience. So it ended the emotional agony I was feeling at that point. In the case of Hiroshima, an aphorism came to my mind today that for me does rise to the occasion of the horror. Now, it might seem presumptuous to say that, but again, I'm just dealing with my intellectual and emotional response to that experience as encountering it from this distance of years and space and time, right? So the aphorism was, we suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. When I say that to myself and I imagine Hiroshima, that seems to me to rise to the level of the occasion. But if it does, it's simply because philosophy, as extreme as Hiroshima was, and it was extreme not just in terms of the scientific technological accomplishment that it represented in terms of the atomic bomb, but extreme in the horror that was inflicted, that was experienced by the population. Well, Hiroshima embodies extremes. The Olympics embodies extremes. I am drawn to extremes. Religions embody extreme solutions. Christianity starts from a man being tortured to death. There is no more extreme set of circumstances than that. It addresses that horror as it attempts to solve the problem of human life, as it attempts to represent forms of salvation. If you're going to solve problems of that extremity, that depth, well, you have to address the worst. If you can address the worst, then you can address more minor issues, headaches, even adoption. It's minor compared to being tortured to death. The experience of Hiroshima was a torture to death on a mass scale. Well, so philosophy deals with extremes. Rigor is an extreme criterion, an extreme demand. And so if anything can address the limit of horror, it is the limit of rigor. So again, that aphorism, we suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. It deals with suffering. The extremity of suffering is what we're addressing here when we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It deals with presumption. Hell is presumption. I read a lot about that in varieties of places. And the end of time, to the end of time, that was the nature of the experience that day. And a few days later at Nagasaki. Okay, when I first thought of the topic and began outlining it, what really came to mind were some lines from the Bhagavad Gita. And they are lines in which Krishna, who is an incarnation of the supreme Hindu deity Vishnu, so Krishna is a Christ figure within the Hindu tradition, says to Arjuna, a warrior, reveals to Arjuna the nature of the supreme deity. And the Bhagavad Gita, by the way, means Song of God. So this revelation takes the form, among rivers, I am the Ganges. Among purifiers, I am the wind. I am time without end. And I am death. I am death that seizes all, and the source of all that shall be born. I am beautiful speech memory, steadfastness, and forgiveness, and the silence of things secret. Now, what's especially noteworthy about that converges with what I've just been describing in terms of Hiroshima in its extremity, is the extremity of God's revelation, of Krishna's revelation of the nature of Vishnu, the nature of the supreme deity. He specifically identifies the deity with the extremes of experience. Among rivers, he is the Ganges. He's all rivers, but in particular, he's the greatest of all rivers. Among purifiers, he's the wind. He's all purifiers, but in particular, most profoundly, most quintessentially, he is the greatest of all purifiers. And his death, the supreme instrument of destruction. He is identified with everything that is supreme, everything that is extreme. So that's, again, what we're dealing with here. That's the significance from one direction of Hiroshima. And what I'm going to be developing in the course, of the hour is the convergences that make Hiroshima as significant an event as it is. I'm going to be talking about the factors that fed into it, that converged upon it to bring it about. Some of the really convergences that from the other direction come out of it in terms of affecting our contemporary world. And in particular, I want to talk about a conversation that I had with Edwin Reischauer, who was a professor at Harvard when I was a freshman. During freshman orientation, we're allowed to select some professors to meet with in small groups. And the professors will have kind of an intimate conversation with us, like a small seminar. Typically, there might be 6, 8, 10 students, in the group, and a world-renowned professor. One of the professors I chose to meet with was Reischauer, who had been ambassador to Japan during the 1960s under the Kennedy administration. He was also a principal advisor to the army in Japan during World War II on military intelligence. He was a Japanese expert, and he was part of the discussions that resulted in the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and subsequently on Nagasaki. And he explained to us the reasoning behind that decision. So I'm going to convey to you the different dimensions, of that decision, factors that went into it that seem not to be broadly appreciated, widely appreciated. That will come, more towards the end. But I also want to make the point, in terms of extremities, and in terms of the philosophical interest in the extreme, we find this when we're interested in achieving a synoptic vision of the world, a comprehensive vision. A comprehensive vision has to address the most terrific, the most sublime. And you see this illustrated in major works of art, the greatest of all works of art, in classical antiquity, in ancient Greek theater. A playwright was either a tragedian, he wrote tragedy that ended badly, or he wrote comedy that ended well. Well, Shakespeare was one of the first great writers to combine the two into a single work. There is humor and there is horror in his plays. In a play like King Lear, There's the role of the fool that provides sort of a comic aspect, a comic relief even, a comic perspective. And there's horrific circumstances that the characters live through that are transformative of their character, of their perspective. It's something you see in Dante, right, the great Italian epic poet who wrote of hell, of purgatory, and of heaven, of the movement from the most horrific, the ninth circle of hell, to the most sublime, a vision of God. That range of perspective is part of what it means to have a view of the whole. And if philosophy is engaged in anything, it's achieving a perspective on the whole. Right? Well, you find this also famously in the American poet Walt Whitman, who was what we might describe as a pantheist. He saw God, in a leaf of grass, in everything. He celebrated the world around him. And he wrote gloriously of its glories. He's considered one of the greatest of all poets, and certainly one of the greatest of all American poets, ranking alongside Emily Dickinson. Though, in my estimation, I give the nod to Emily Dickinson, but that's partly because of the character of her poetry. But aside from that, Walt Whitman is one of the world's greatest poets. He attended a sermon one Sunday morning, and the reverend was describing aspects of experience, giving a sort of a sense of the nature of life, of existence. And he was emphasizing the glorious aspects of it, the sublimities of it, the good. And Whitman came away thinking, well, yes, there is that certainly, but he felt that honestly represented, when you have when you look at the world, as most people experience it, the glories and the beauties and the sublimities, in Whitman's estimation, were maybe 1/20th of the whole. And the other 19/20ths, not so embraceable. And he wrote a short poem. It's actually an unpleasant poem. It's called The Rounded Catalogue Divine Complete. And in it, he talks about disgusting aspects of experience. And he concludes that this too is part of the world. This might be the greater part of the world, but it's necessary to come to terms with it because it is essential if we're going to establish a complete picture of the world. Well, that's partly what we're addressing here, right? That as glorious, for example, as the Olympics are, as much as they represent human possibility, the possibility of transcending human limitation, the possibility of struggle to ultimate triumph, there's also Hiroshima. And what's important to keep in mind about Hiroshima is it too is an extraordinary convergence of the most extraordinary scientific and technological achievement of humanity up to that time, resulting in, again, the experience of the greatest horror. So great that after Nagasaki, it has not been repeated. And to my mind, is likely not ever to be repeated, the horror being so manifest, so undeniable, so beyond human comprehension, really. Okay. The atomic bomb was developed as part of what's called the Manhattan Project. Um, it, it reached its fulfillment on July 16th, its initial proof of principle, on July 16th, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, a state in the southwest portion of the United States, near a town called Alamogordo. The bomb, the atomic bomb, was first tested on July 16th at 5:30 in the morning. The person in charge of the atomic bomb development, the scientific enterprise, was J. Robert Oppenheimer. I've referred to him before. He was an American theoretical physicist, intellectual in a lot of different directions. I mentioned in the past that he'd gone to Harvard and spent his time there doing much what I did there, reading books in the library. He'd also started studying physics around the age when I did, around the age of 10, 11. So, when I was younger, I identified a little bit with Oppenheimer. He's a tragic figure, though. When the bomb was first tested on that morning, and what was tested was one of two types of bombs that had been developed. One was called Little Boy. That was the bomb in the shape of a cylinder, a long cylinder, that was dropped on Hiroshima. The other bomb that was developed, the other type of bomb, was called Fat Man. It looked like a big egg. It was an implosion type device. The cylindrical bomb, Little Boy, developed and eventually dropped on Hiroshima, was a bomb in which one piece of uranium is shot into another piece of uranium to give what's called a critical mass, enough uranium present to permit fission, breaking of atoms of uranium, and an explosion. The breaking of the atoms happens within a millionth of a second, and it generates enormous amounts of energy. The other type of bomb was called an implosion device, and that was where it's actually plutonium, another type of radioactive substance, was arranged around the sphere, the ovoid. Explosive charges compressed the plutonium, the radioactive material, to a critical mass where, again, a similar thing happened. Enough fission, enough breaking of nuclei, releasing enough energy occurred to create an explosion. There were two such implosion devices built. It was the more complicated design. And so that was the design that was tested that morning at a site designated by Oppenheimer, Trinity Site. It was successful. Okay. The explosion generated something like almost 20,000, equivalent of 20,000 tons of TNT. It was spectacularly successful. There was pride in the accomplishment. The scientists engaged in this enterprise were, from their perspective, doing basic science and basic engineering. When this was successful, it was a great proof of a scientific hope and principle. And they were engaged in that process intellectually and creatively. The words that went through Oppenheimer's mind at the moment of the explosion, the successful test of the device, were also from the Bhagavad Gita. And it actually is from that passage that I recited a little bit ago. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He identified, though, with that. Now I am become death. He was later celebrated as the father of the atomic bomb. And to all accounts, he recognized the consequences in terms of what had happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but from a scientific standpoint, in terms of having achieved what he was entrusted to do, he embraced it. He was proud of that encomium, that designation. When I say, but it tormented him, the use of the weapon, and he advocated strongly against the development of the hydrogen bomb, the much more powerful nuclear device that was developed largely under the guidance of another physicist at Los Alamos. That was where the scientific establishment to develop the bomb was, Edward Teller. Because of Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb, primarily his security clearance was withdrawn. And so he was sort of excluded from leading edge developments in physics in the later part of his life, and he suffered that exclusion. Edward Teller also embraced this enterprise with an element of pride and a almost reactive pride, in the sense that a lot of the politicians, political figures that knew of the project, and there were very few, this was one of the development of the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project itself, was one of the most carefully guarded secrets in all of human history, given the scale of the undertaking. And by the way, the scale of the undertaking was such that it's been said that somewhere between 10 and 20% of all of the energy used in the United States during World War II went into the project in the effort to basically separate the isotopes of uranium that were necessary in order to achieve fission, to achieve a destructive device. Hundreds of thousands of people were employed in the project, but there were major sites around the country, enormous complexes built for different aspects of the development and the engineering. The Vice President of the United States, though, Vice President Truman, did not know of the project. That's how much the secrecy was guarded and confined to relatively small numbers of people. But it's been estimated a couple of dozen, maybe even less, knew exactly what was being done, knew what all the components of this enormous enterprise were adding up to, or aiming to achieve. But Edward Teller felt that the people that did know didn't have much confidence in the project and didn't have much respect for the scientists and for what they were aiming to achieve. They didn't think it was really going to work. It was very ambitious. It was relying upon a lot of new physics, and it involved an enormous amount of complex engineering. So, there wasn't a lot of confidence that this would actually bear fruit. So, Edward Teller once made the remark, and the atomic bomb, as it was under development, was called the gadget. That was how it was designated. He said, people think the gadget is just an experiment. Well, once it is used, it will no longer be an experiment. So again, Teller was invested in really the power that the project aspired to unleash, that it represented, from the basic physics, the extraordinary physics that fed into it to, again, the working out of the extraordinary details, the technical details required to achieve this result. For example, one of the key aspects of the undertaking was to acquire enough, separate enough, isolate enough of this fissionable isotope of uranium, uranium-235 it's called. Most uranium is uranium-238, only less than like 1% is uranium-235. The two have to be separated. Uranium-238, 99% of the uranium that you get when you mine uranium is not useful for making a fission reaction and not useful for a bomb. The process of separating that was difficult, challenging. Adding to the difficulty of the undertaking was no one knew how much uranium-235 would be needed. It's been said that early on in the project, it was as if you were preparing for a wedding. This is the analogy that one of the physicists on the project used. It's as if you were preparing for a wedding, but you don't know how many guests you're preparing for. Somewhere between 10 guests and 1,000 guests. Well, that's the kind of sort of scientific and technological challenge these scientists were facing and these engineers were facing. How much uranium do we need? We have no idea. So the notion that this would become a successful project and deliver an operational weapon, let alone the most powerful, most overwhelmingly devastating weapon in history, was still no more than a possibility. And to many, not a very great possibility. The project started, the whole enterprise to try to develop the atomic bomb, started actually in 1939. And it began with a visit from a physicist, a Hungarian physicist, Leo Szilard, who had emigrated from Europe to the United States. And I think 1933, when many other physicists from Europe emigrated to escape the rising tide of totalitarianism and ethnic hostility. He was a brilliant physicist and was working on fission and a chain reaction, the kind of reaction that's at the core of what an atomic bomb accomplishes. He was aware of developments in Germany, like in the late 1930s. In particular, that German physicist Lise Meitner was one of the exemplary ones, had achieved fission, nuclear fission, breaking apart an atom of uranium to release energy. And when that atom breaks apart, it also releases neutrons that can break, neutrons are like bullets that can break apart other nuclei. And that's the basis of a chain reaction. So Szilard knew of these experiments in Germany. He also knew that there was apparently moves in Germany to restrict export of uranium. So it looked as if there was interest in nuclear fission and its potential destructive possibilities. So Szilard wanted to alert President Roosevelt of the danger of Germany developing such a weapon. Szilard was not well known outside the scientific community. He didn't have a lot of prestige. He went to the physicist who had the most prestige of any physicist in the world, Albert Einstein. We have some images I can show you of Szilard approaching Einstein with a letter that he had prepared, a draft of a letter to send to Roosevelt. He hoped with Einstein's signature to give it credibility so that Roosevelt would pay particular attention to it, about the danger that the the danger that Germany's sort of forays, its exploration of nuclear fission posed. Let me show you. We have a photograph. You can see these online as well. Here's a photograph of Einstein and Szilard meeting to discuss the letter. Szilard has the letter in his hand, and he's reviewing it with Einstein, hoping to secure Einstein's signature. He does. The letter, and this was prepared in August or so of 1939. Okay, this is shortly before Hitler invades Poland to initiate World War II. The letter also exists. Again, I don't know if you can see that well. It's going to be too hard to read, but there is the letter. It's readable online. The Einstein-Szilard letter, or Einstein letter to Roosevelt in August 1939. And I just want to read you one paragraph from that letter that distills the essence of the issue. Oops, let me just get to it. The paragraph reads, in the course of the last 4 months, remember this was written in August 1939. In the course of the last 4 months, it has been made probable that it may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new uranium-like elements would be generated. Now it appears almost certain that this could be achieved in the immediate future. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, atomic bombs, nuclear weapons. So that's the alerting of, that's Einstein's letter that, again, drafted by Szilard, signed by Einstein, delivered to Roosevelt. Now, this is 2 years before Pearl Harbor, 2 years before the United States' entry into World War II. Roosevelt established a commission, but really there wasn't much movement on this process, on this project, until Pearl Harbor, 2 years later. And that's when the actual project, the Manhattan Project, is initiated. And by like 1942, the project was was being organized, was being developed. And again, it was in July of 1945 that the bomb was first successfully tested. That's an extraordinary scientific and technological achievement within the space of a few years. And again, it was only achievable by assembling like not only the greatest American physicists, scientists, engineers, for the purpose of carrying out this work, but all of the emigre scientists that had come here, escaping, again, German totalitarianism, German ethnic policies, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Enrico Fermi. The list is illustrious, and it made that development possible. Now, the fear, and these are some photographs of the actual bombs. I'm going to talk about those in a little bit, but The fear clearly was that Germany and Hitler would be seeking to develop just such a weapon. It turns out that those fears were unjustified, that even though Hitler was engaged in a lot of advanced science and technology, Germany, developed the V1, the V2 rockets. They developed, a lot of cutting-edge technology, for the war effort. Hitler was always envisioning new miracle weapons, that would help facilitate a victory even as he was losing the war, victory increasingly against all odds. The atomic bomb was never developed and apparently never seriously undertaken as a project. Nevertheless, the United States, the Allies, were concerned about what might be happening, sort of beneath the surface. Although Germany had lost really about 40% of its top-level physicists to emigration, lost them mostly to the United States, as I was saying, it still had, a large number of accomplished scientists and physicists and engineers. Most prominently, it had Werner Heisenberg, the one physicist who was effectively at the level of Einstein. He was responsible for quantum mechanics and was considered capable of overseeing the development of an atomic bomb. So the United States was concerned about Heisenberg's potential role in this process. They sent a spy over to Germany by the name of Moberg. Moberg had gone to Princeton. He was very intelligent. He spoke German fluently. He actually was something of a linguist. I think he was also a baseball player. He was sent over to Germany on a mission. He was sent to attend a scientific conference at which Heisenberg would be speaking. He was sent to the conference with a gun. He was told to listen carefully to Heisenberg's talk, to see if he mentioned anything about nuclear fission, anything that suggested that he might be helping to coordinate a project to develop an atomic bomb. If he heard anything that was suggestive of such an enterprise, Berg was ordered to stand up and shoot and kill Heisenberg. Well, in the course of the lecture, Heisenberg did not make any suggestive references. And again, we know why. Germany was not engaged in such an undertaking. I mean, seeing what was involved in the US enterprise, to achieve that result, it might have really been beyond the resources that Germany could reasonably have spared, scientifically and technologically. In any case, Germany did not develop the bomb, and the actual atomic bomb was intended for use against Germany. It turns out, though, as we've seen, the bomb was first tested on July 16th. The war in Europe, the defeat of Germany, was effected by May 8th. So basically, the bomb was not used against Germany because it wasn't ready. It's actually a point I make with people. Deadlines at the highest level are arbitrary and really sort of fall away. The deadlines that people impose for example, in school, as we're growing up, are completely arbitrary. At the highest levels, there are no deadlines. If the bomb is not ready, it is not ready. At Harvard, it was common understanding that if you were in a class that had a term paper, it was just customary to be granted extensions on term papers. I didn't know this as a freshman. Freshman year, I turned everything on time. I found out by sophomore year, and from that point forward, I never turned anything in on time because we were automatically granted extensions of time. The deadlines were really quite arbitrary and not enforced. One of the brightest people that I knew at Harvard was customarily given extensions over the summer to complete work and turn in papers. Again, if the atomic bomb isn't ready, it's not ready. It wasn't ready. So it's a matter of turning to the theater in which warfare was still continuing, and that was the Asian theater. Now, a lot of this talk has been, I think, sort of historically focused, but I want to make a reference to some of the philosophical underpinnings. I started out basically addressing some of that, but and it's something that I've talked about in some previous talks, the idea that ultimately the atomic bomb was based upon Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. Einstein did not know that fission, a chain reaction, an atomic bomb would even be possible when he formulated that equation. It came as a surprise to him, and he admitted that. The equation itself, and I've gone into this a little bit also in previous talks, is grounded in Einstein's fundamental relationship to physics and how he approached it, namely from a philosophical perspective. Einstein was doing the physics of existentialism. The theory of relativity is based upon the fundamental circumstance that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside. It's actually based on the same perspective that guided Heisenberg in the development of quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle, that whatever we observe, we inevitably disturb. To imagine otherwise is to imagine us viewing the world from the outside. And that is an abstraction, not a reality. And the stronger physics is achieved by embracing what I call the epistemic reality, that we cannot see the world from the outside. Ultimately, E equals mc squared has its roots in that philosophical perspective, the perspective of existentialism. It's interesting that at his death, Einstein's desk was covered with papers, covered with journals, covered with articles. You can only read one name of one journal, and that is philosophy. That's the only word that is obvious, it's legible if you look at Einstein's desk. And again, you can go online and just look up, Einstein's desk at his death, and you will see the prominence of the word philosophy. Einstein considered himself a physicist philosopher. In the film, A Beautiful Mind, there's a comment made early on that mathematicians won World War II. The character was talking about the code breakers, people that helped break the Enigma code that Germany used to transmit, correspondence, gave orders and the like, from central headquarters to generals to troops. Well, in terms of the Pacific theater, insofar as the atomic bomb was central to bringing the war to an end, well, philosophy ended the war because philosophy was the distinguishing feature of how Einstein did physics. It's what separated his approach to the subject from that of everyone else, except Heisenberg. Now, Germany had been defeated. The bomb had been tested on July 16th. The war in the Pacific was still raging. The United States was engaged in island hopping to try to get close enough to Japan to be able to bomb the Japanese mainland and also to have a point of delivery for an atomic bomb if it came to that. An invasion of Japan was planned for. It was, given the nature of the fighting on the islands like Okinawa, Iwo Jima, approaching Japan, the fierceness of the Japanese defense, the Japanese fighting literally to the last man, the commitment of the Japanese to victory at all costs, the kamikaze pilot, of which there were several thousand, were an example of this commitment to sacrificing one's life, to avoid the humiliation of defeat. So it was anticipated that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would be just a horrifically costly enterprise in terms of human life. The success of the American operation in getting close to Japan to be able to bomb it was an important feature of the final months of the war. Strategic bombing was introduced actually in World War I, but it became a mainstay of World War II. The feeling was that a city, a country could be bombed into submission if enough civilian targets, infrastructure, and military targets were targeted for destruction. The devastation that bombing could do, the horror psychologically that bombing could inflict, it was hoped would be able to achieve capitulation. It didn't work. It didn't work in Britain with the Battle of Britain. It didn't work in Germany with the firebombing of cities like Dresden. It didn't work in Japan. By the time the atomic bombs were ready, 67 Japanese cities had been leveled, had been firebombed by American bombers. There was the country was starving. There was no capitulation. And so the United States, in planning the invasion of the Japanese mainland, actually had 500,000 Purple Hearts manufactured. Purple Hearts were the medals, the awards given to soldiers who were wounded in combat, casualties of combat. It was expected that that number at a minimum would be needed. It turns out to this day, the United States is still giving out Purple Hearts from that original manufactured total, intended for the consequences of the invasion of Japan. It would have been the greatest amphibian invasion in history, dwarfing that of Normandy and the invasion of Europe on D-Day. Well, okay, so I mentioned Edwin Reischauer, the academic, a leading military advisor, an intelligence officer, during World War II, a Japanese expert, somebody, again, who became ambassador to Japan subsequently, and who was involved in the discussions about whether or not to drop the bomb, how to deal with the atomic bombs now that they had them. And I met with him as a freshman. And here is what he said. And again, we need to sort of put ourselves back in the circumstances of the time, right? That is critical in doing philosophy. That's a matter of seeing the world from within. I emphasize the distinction between the philosophic, the rigorous, the epistemic, and the approximate, the heuristic. The heuristic is the world seen in approximation from the outside. The epistemic is the world seen in precision from within. So we try to imagine ourselves back at that time. Here are the main considerations. First of all, some of the scientists, like Edward Teller, had confidence in the bomb, in the technology, and its ability to actually work. Most didn't. These were complex devices, among the most complex ever developed. One had been tested, but remember, one of two designs had been tested. That was that egg-shaped bomb. And that was tested not really as a bomb to be dropped from a plane. It was tested on a tower. The process of dropping the bomb from the plane had enough inherent sort of issues that could have thwarted a successful mission. The other bomb, the bomb that was intended for Hiroshima, there was only one copy of that had never been tested in any form. I mean, earlier stages of development in parts, bits, and pieces of the mechanism, yes, but not the entire design. And until you test the entire design, you have no idea, especially given a device of that complexity. Okay. So, overall, maybe the possibility of the bomb actually working was given about a 10% chance. Okay? The main consideration that came up during these discussions was, what about a demonstration? Rather than inflict the horror of the bombing on a population, military or otherwise, do a demonstration. Invite Japanese officials to a location, an island, a something. Drop the device, show the magnitude of the destruction, and that should sway the Japanese to surrender. The main reason why that was not adopted as the approach was, well, first there were two. The United States at that point had just two bombs. One had been tested. Now there was the little boy, the one designed for Hiroshima, the cylindrical one, and Fat Man, the one that was eventually dropped on Nagasaki. Just two bombs. That was it. Okay? The level of confidence in one of these bombs working was very low. And people were fundamentally afraid that they would invite the Japanese to a demonstration and nothing would happen, and that would end the possibility of a negotiated settlement. There was no confidence. I mean, obviously now we look back and say, well, it worked. Well, at that time, they did not think it was going to work, especially the politicians. A few scientists did, other scientists, again, did not have a high level of confidence. There was just too much that had to go right and too much that could go wrong. Short circuit, just any number of things. So that was like the main consideration. We have just two bombs. We don't have a high level of confidence this is going to work, so we really have to use it. But we can't announce that we're dropping an atomic bomb for the same reason. We don't know it's going to work. But what was decided was the cities had to be warned. And they were. Leaflets were dropped, were distributed throughout the country to all the major prospective targets. That included Hiroshima, that included Nagasaki. Leaflets warning not of a specific atomic bomb, because again, they didn't know that would work, but warning of possible devastation to come in the next few days. And here's what one of these letters, I think we have, because time is good. I want to read you a little bit from one of these leaflets that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and other cities. And it reads, oh, by the way, here is Edwin Reischauer. Again, you'll be able to look him up, okay? That is actually very much how he looked when I met with him. Okay, let me start 1 second. Okay, so before the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, this is what was distributed throughout the country, dropped as leaflets on different cities, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Read this carefully, and obviously I'm reading the English translation. It was originally in Japanese. Read this carefully, as it may save your life or the life of a relative or friend. In the next few days, some or all of the cities named in the reverse side will be destroyed by American bombs. These cities contain military installations and workshops or factories which produce military goods. That was true of Hiroshima. We are determined to destroy all of the tools of the military clique which they are using to prolong this useless war. But unfortunately, bombs have no eyes. So, in accordance with America's humanitarian policies, the American Air Force, which does not wish to injure innocent people, now gives you warning to evacuate the cities named and save your lives. And again, among those cities, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. America is not fighting the Japanese people, but is fighting the military clique which has enslaved the Japanese people. The peace which America will bring will free the people from the oppression of the military clique and mean the emergence of a new and better Japan. You can restore peace by demanding new and good leaders who will end the war. We cannot promise that only these cities will be among those attacked, but some or all of them will be. So heed this warning and evacuate these cities immediately. Okay? Hiroshima was given a warning. Now, obviously it wasn't heeded or heeded to, the degree that would have saved. And the loss of life at Hiroshima is hard to be certain of. There are every time you read a different article, you'll get different numbers. Maybe 70,000 people were killed almost immediately, 100,000 or so shortly thereafter, 200,000 in the course of maybe a month because of radiation sickness. But a horrific toll. And I already mentioned how that it was experienced as the end of the world, as hell. As having awakened to hell. And the mushroom cloud was Hiroshima. There was no capitulation after the first bomb. The United States now had just one more bomb. The reason to drop it on Nagasaki was to create the impression that the country had a lot of such weapons, so that if the Japanese did not surrender at that point, they would continue to suffer that type of devastation. Before the Nagasaki bomb, other leaflets were distributed around the country, this time making explicit reference to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And let me read you quickly one of those. again, the point is that as horrific this was, measures were taken, and there were reasons, as I said, why the bombs were dropped and not subject to a demonstration, right? So, attention, Japanese people, evacuate your cities. This is the banner, of the leaflets that were distributed, dropped on cities after Hiroshima. Because your military leaders have rejected the 13-part surrender declaration, 2 momentous events have occurred in the last few days. And it notes the Soviet Union has now entered the war against you. In addition, it goes down to note, also because of your leaders' refusal to accept the surrender declaration that would enable Japan to honorably end this useless war, we have employed our atomic bomb. That was the reference to the bombing of Hiroshima the day before, 2 days before these leaflets were distributed. A single one of our newly developed atomic bombs is actually the equivalent in explosive power to what 2,000 of our giant B-29s could have carried on a single mission. Radio Tokyo has told you that with the first use of this weapon of total destruction, Hiroshima was virtually destroyed. Before we use this bomb again and again to destroy every resource of the military by which they are prolonging this useless war, petition the Emperor now to end the war. Act at once, or we shall resolutely employ this bomb and all of our other superior weapons to promptly and forcefully end the war. So again, there were warnings. And not only were there were warnings after Hiroshima of the nature of the Hiroshima attack, the nature of that new weapon. And those leaflets were distributed with that image of the Hiroshima devastation. So these were not surprise attacks. It was understood the magnitude of what was being inflicted upon the Japanese people, and measures were taken to avoid it. And again, against the background of the likelihood in the thinking of many of the scientists and the political leaders that it wouldn't work at all. Okay, so that's some of the background, okay, to the actual circumstances behind the use of those weapons. Now, Ali has actually shown you a few photographs of the actual bombs before they were used. You can see those online. I was going to say more about them, but we're running out of time, and I wanted to end on a slightly different note. But one thing, so there is actually an image of the actual bomb dropped on Hiroshima. That is what was called Little Boy. That was the cylindrical bomb that had never been tested before. And again, that it wasn't clear if it was going to work at all. It had never been tried. One of the significances of those images that I just wanted to kind of point out is that, and there's actually covered the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. That had been tried once. That was the bomb that was tested at Trinity site on July 16th, but it was tested stationary at the top of a tower. It had never been dropped from a plane. Again, the chances of it not working were much greater than the chances of it actually detonating, okay? So one thing, when I first saw those images about a year and a half ago, a friend had forwarded them to me. They struck me as the most convergent, the most compelling, the most significant photographs in history. And the reason I say that is how convergent they are. And I'll just do this kind of briefly, because I don't want to run out of time. What feeds into that, you've already been seeing, hearing from my presentation, the work of Einstein, the greatest of all modern physicists. His equation E equals mc squared is the basis of it. That is the most important equation probably in the history of physics. That's the most convergent equation in the history of physics, in that it achieves a convergence of energy and mass, the two fundamental physical quantities. It represents an event, the culmination of World War II, the greatest conflict in human history. It featured the tyranny and the horrors of the Holocaust, and the totalitarianism perpetrated by Hitler, seen as one of the greatest villains, one of the most evil human beings in history. The magnitude of the war, the numbers involved in World War II, and convergence is also a matter of numbers, are in the thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions in whichever direction you look. 50 million people died overall during the war. It was on a scale that had never been seen before. All of these are factors that feed into the significance of those weapons. The weapons were developed as a result of the Manhattan Project, the most ambitious scientific and technological undertaking in history. It was a $2 billion project, the most expensive except for the $2.5 billion project to develop the B-29 bomber to deliver the bomb. So the scale of what we are talking about is unimaginable. And Hiroshima represents, again, as horrific a circumstance as any human beings have ever had to endure. The consequences of that, though, are almost with us on a daily basis. There's a newspaper columnist who writes for the New York Times. His name is S.Friedman, no relation. He's written recently about Putin and why Putin is so prominent still, on the world stage. It's China that matters now, not Russia, which is diminished since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Well, I read an article recently, again, this is online, there's a number, 6,500. There's another number, 5,800. 5,800 is the number of nuclear warheads the United States has. That's far greater than any other country, except the country that has 6,500, and that's Russia. And in fact, at this recent summit between Biden and Putin, when Putin was summarizing, giving his closing remarks, the first thing he referenced was that Russia and the United States were the world's two great nuclear powers. That number, 6,500, is in Putin's mind all the time. The significance of nuclear capacity is what drives the policies, the politics of North Korea. When recently, and this was a little like back and forth between Putin and Biden, Biden was asked if he thought Putin was a killer. And because of stories of spies that had been poisoned, or citizens, political opponents, opposition that had been poisoned, and Biden responded, yes, think so. And when Putin was told that, his response, and it was a public response, was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay? So these are present now, and they are still controlling aspects of our world. And I hope, yes, I have a few more minutes. So what I wanted to close with is a few paragraphs of a short story that I wrote. It's set in Hiroshima on that morning, August 6th. And it's from the perspective of a little girl. Okay? It's just a few paragraphs of a much longer story. And here it goes. And I will conclude the Hiroshima and Nagasaki talk with this. Okay, it was a strange morning. Why? Partly because it didn't feel strange at all. Certainly not by the standards of the day. Those days, those not at all too normal ones to begin with, but all things considered, forgettable. That's how it started anyway. A boringly pretty, dry, dull, late summer day. Did you ever hear the story? I think it's a story, made up, not real, too good to be real, of King George going to bed after a long summer day of being king. Quote, an unexceptional day, this old English king wrote in his diary, July 4th, 1776. This day was that kind of day, the kind of day that one day will never go away. What does a 10-year-old wake to do on a late summer day? Play and play and play. The older you get, the better you must get at play. It's like my mother says, all the time. Tokyo wasn't built in a day. Of course not. It takes a lot of practice to learn to play. I'm sure I'll be telling my kids, you can't get good at play in a single little day. I'm like a clock. On a summer day like today, if you want to know when it's 8 a.m., well, just watch my eyes. When they pop open, yep, you guessed it, 8 a.m. Guessing the time is one of my favorite games. I'm always trying to get better at it. Being funny is also something I want to get better at, but that takes time too. I think you live as long as it takes to get really good at what's really important, like knowing how to be funny and knowing how to play. I guess that means I'm going to live a really long time because I have a long way to go to get good. Now, I'm going to guess. Let's see. Concentrate very, very, very hard. Okay, here goes. It's now 8:16. 8:16. Am I right? The end of 8:16 a.m. local time, August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan. Okay, now
Thank you
we
very
only
much.
have like a minute. I had a question last time that I will address, and that is my favorite Olympic sports. At the beginning of last week, when the Olympics began, I would have told you any sport I'm watching is my favorite sport because I really seem to like all of them. But now, as I have a little sort of distance from the events, gymnastics without question. Okay, because again, they represent the extremity of human performance. They are the most difficult, the most challenging, the most extraordinary. I can hit a baseball, not well, but I've had that experience. I can make a basket, with a basketball. I've had that experience. I can run a race. I won't win, but I know what it's like to run. I can swim. I love swimming. I might have I was good at swimming in camp, not at anything close to an Olympic level, but I like swimming. I could not imagine myself ever doing what these gymnasts are able to accomplish, not even close. So that boggles my mind. So that is my favorite sport because again, it, I think, is the most demanding, the most challenging, the most dangerous, and just the most inspiring because you're operating at the limit of human capability and a little bit beyond. So that is my favorite.
Super.
Okay, I think that's it probably. We'll have to leave questions for next time. Yes.
So, one more time, Stephen, thank you very much for being with us every Friday. We really appreciate your work and time and dedication. Also, big thanks to the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty. And thank you, the audience, for joining us weekly. We see your all comments and your feedback. Thank you very much. We appreciate it all. For today, we don't really have any questions so far, but after the lecture, we will definitely send the questions left to Steven, so he will answer them next week. Thank you very much one more time. See you all next week and stay safe. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. See you next week. Thanks so much.